I'm Ellen Cassidy. I was born in 1950 in Brooklyn, New York, and I grew up in the Baltimore and Washington area, and then went to high school on Long Island in New York. My father was a professor of electrical engineering. My mother was both a homemaker and a writer of very literary, wonderful children's books. And I grew up in a house that was just full of words and books that influenced my later life as a writer. And I also grew up in a home where social issues were very much a part of daily life. Baltimore was a segregated city, legally segregated in the 1950s. And my parents used to drive me and my brother through different neighborhoods and talk to us about segregation and civil rights. And I was involved with my parents in civil rights demonstrations and peace demonstrations while I was growing up.
Did you have siblings?
I have 3 siblings, yes, very spread out across an 18-year period.
Good, good. And ethnically, you're identified as?
White, and also my mother was Jewish. My father was, as he would put it, not. He was brought up as a sort of going to whatever Protestant church was nearby. And that was in the neighborhoods where we lived, that was very unusual. So I thought of myself as kind of mixed, from a mixed marriage. And I think that was actually very important to my growing identity as somebody who was used to kind of reaching out across cultural and class and racial divides.
When did you begin to be aware of yourself as a woman or be aware of the women's movement?
I think very early on, I was very aware of gender and what girls were supposed to do and what boys were supposed to do. And when I was 15, I read The Feminine Mystique, and I felt kind of terrified by it in 2 dimensions. One was the portrait of disaffected, bored women was very searing and hard to read. And the other thing was, the other dimension of being afraid was, I wondered whether I was going to be able to fulfill my destiny to be all that I could be as a full human being. And I wasn't sure that I could. And I think that I grew up on the sort of cusp of that girls like me both did and did not expect to have careers and do something other than being a mom and a housewife. That when I got into college in 1968, the women's movement was just beginning to blossom. And I was shy and I was reluctant. And I was at the University of Chicago for 2 years, and I attended a meeting of a group called WRAP, Women's Radical Action Project, I think it was. And what that consisted of was sitting around in a circle and talking about what it was like being a young woman at this university. My heart was in my throat. I could barely speak. I then transferred to the University of California at Berkeley, and by that time I was much more ready. First of all, campuses all over the country were exploding and all kinds of assumptions were up in the air, and the Vietnam War was in full swing, and things really changed between 1968 and 1970. And by the time I got to the Bay Area, I was ready to join the women's movement. And I read Sisterhood is Powerful, and I joined a consciousness raising group. And I also became part of the women's studies explosion at the university. Women's studies became my major, women's history, especially labor history. And I attended classes with instructors who were just beginning to tiptoe into women's history. And they would come to class just desperate to share what they had found. And the walls of the classroom were lined with auditors, women who were not actually enrolled at the university, but really were dying to hear this information. And it was this totally electric atmosphere. And we were really discovering something about ourselves and about our society and about our history. And I ended up writing a paper, my senior thesis, on the Women's Trade Union League. This was a group that was sort of adjacent to the huge women garment workers strikes of the early 20th century, like the uprising of the 20,000, these huge strikes that totally transformed the garment industry, the mills, and the labor movement itself. And the Women's Trade Union League was women who, it was a coalition of women garment workers and also middle-class women who wanted to support them. And they would bring out these like rich New York wealthy women would get on the picket line and get covered in the newspaper, and it had a big impact. Much later, when I was part of starting 9 to 5, the Working Women's Organization, I realized that this organization was sort of like the grandmother of 9 to 5. It was not exactly in the labor movement, but it was adjacent to it and it was helping it. And there was an intersection of women of different classes and sort of new creative tactics other than simply the labor strike or the sit-down strike or whatever.
You're at Berkeley, you're in your senior year, and what comes next?
Then, as I was graduating, as I explained, I wasn't really sure what to do, you know, as many people are at 22, but also I think at that age, it was 1972, and I wasn't sure that I was going to have a career, a full career as a full working woman and so on. Also, the whole country was in turmoil at the time. My friend from the University of Chicago, Karen Nussbaum, was in Boston, and I went to visit her, and she said, why don't you move here to Boston and join this peace organization and work against the Vietnam War? And I thought, okay, I don't have anything else to do. I think I'll do that. And pretty soon our money ran out and we had to get jobs, and we got jobs as clerk typist at Harvard University. And there, the germs of 9 to 5 took root. We looked around and we heard people, first of all, at that time, it was right at the tipping point of the US economy where more and more women were flooding into the workforce, both because women wanted to work and also because it was no longer possible to support a family on one income for many people. Now, this had been true for families of color for many years, but for many, many white families, it was brand new that women who had not expected to work had to work. And so we looked around our offices and there were women of all classes, all ages, and people were starting to say some of the same things. The ideas of the civil rights movement and of the women's movement were seeping in. And even though the women in our offices were not participants in the women's movement, didn't go on into demonstrations and so on, they were talking about equality and they were talking about wanting to be treated fairly on the job. And this was a real revelation for us. And so we started meeting on Thursdays at lunch hour and talking about our jobs. And that turned into a citywide organization that we named 9 to 5 after the hours of working day. And that was the beginning of our organization. And after we had sat around and scratched our heads for a while, we heard about a training school for organizers called the Midwest Academy that was going to take place in Chicago in the summer of 1973. And the group decided to send me. And it cost $500, which we didn't have. And we went around and we collected these pennies and got our money together. And I went off to the university, to Chicago, where I had gone to the university, and went to the Midwest Academy. And my eyes were opened, and I learned all kinds of things about sort of the tactics of community organizing, and also just the very concept of being organized, wearing a watch. In those days, you had a little stack of index cards that you carried around where you wrote down the name of everybody you met and a little something about them. And I really learned the nuts and bolts of how you listen to people, how you go out and really pay attention to how people are talking about their problems, what those problems are, and what they might be willing to do. And we were instructed, don't start your organization until you really know what you're doing, until you really have an idea for some action that people can take. Don't just bring people together and then sit around and figure out what to do or how to take action. have a plan. And those lessons were so valuable to me. And at the end of the summer of 1973, I came back to Boston. I imparted all this lore to our little group, and we set about on an action plan to find out the facts about women working in Boston's offices, to reach out in a very systematic way to the banks and insurance companies, publishing houses, law firms, universities, and come up with some things we could demand of employers, and then try to win those things. We settled on a plan that I think had three prongs. One was to try to get in the media constantly. And we worked so hard on that. And we were covered all the time by the Boston Globe and the radio stations and TV. And we dreamed up all kinds of crazy things to get the attention of the media. For example, well, let me tell you the other two prongs first. The other thing, next prong was to get the government enforcement agencies working to actually enforce the laws. And then the third one was what you might call whistleblowers. So women who were working in offices who would pass along information that we could use to take action. So as far as press coverage goes, here's an example of what we did. We announced that we were holding a petty office procedure contest, a bad boss contest. And we invited women from all over the city to send in their nominations of the most ridiculous or abusive or annoying thing their boss had ever asked them to do. And we got some amazing nominations. And for example, the boss who had asked his secretary to sew up a hole in his pants while he was wearing them.
Okay.
So we took at lunchtime a group of women from all over the city to go visit this guy and present him with an executive sewing kit. And we brought the TV cameras. And so the cameras rolled and this man came to the door, and some of these men, we did this over and over. Some of them sort of were good-natured about it, and others were not. For example, the man who had fired his secretary for bringing him a corned beef on white instead of rye. He was just adamant, unforgiving. She lost her job. She didn't get it back no matter what we did. And, you know, there were tales of really terrible things that bosses were asking secretaries and office workers to do. And it was an education for everybody, for the women themselves who, you know, women who were watching this thought, maybe I don't have to put up with that. And bosses thought, maybe I should change my ways. We had a huge impact on bosses and coffee. You know, coffee was a giant issue. Who made it? One year we erected a huge coffee cup in Government Center, the main plaza in downtown Boston. No words were necessary. It was just the cup, and it said it all, you know. As far as government enforcement goes, we scoured the books, and there was the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. We didn't always go straight to them. Right. We found these obscure little regulations that said that, for example, the insurance commissioner had the right to step into what was going on in employment and insurance. And so we sort of caught them by surprise. The Department of Public Utilities had never before ruled in its rate increase hearings on how the companies were treating workers and what they were doing as far as their lobbying against women and so on. And we brought that to them, and they took that up, and it just caught them off guard. And we often were able to win things on that. And then in addition to that, there was the issue of the whistleblowers. So pretty soon after we got started, we decided we were going to target the biggest bank in town, the First National Bank. Why the biggest? Partly because it was the biggest. And we figured that other banks probably hated them because they were so big. And they were already under attack for apartheid policies and other, redlining of neighborhoods and so on. So they were kind of weakened. And they definitely had the money. This was a really important thing. Is these clerical industries, they were rolling in cash. You know, these banks were just making profits hand over fist, and yet the clerical workers some of them were eligible for food stamps. So there was plenty of leeway. They could afford to do stuff. So we declared 1979 the year of the first. And we had a big splashy press conference. And the next day, the First National Bank started posting jobs, otherwise known as, when job openings came open, a lot of companies, sort of management just wanted the right to not tell anybody about it and just pick whoever they wanted for the job. And our view was that people who were working in lower jobs should have a career ladder and should know about these jobs and get a chance to apply. So they had already told us they wouldn't do that, but then they changed their mind on the second day. And eventually we ended up winning promotions. 51 women got promoted into management, and they gave a 12% raise, the largest raise they'd ever given in their history. So how do we do that? So the publicity was already going, and they were already being asked by the media, what are you going to do about this? What do you think about this? And their replies were getting printed in the Globe and so on. We passed out a survey, an anonymous survey in front of the bank, and we set up an anonymous hotline for employees. And people could call up and say, here's a horrible thing that just happened to me. I just trained a man to be my replacement. I've been here 15 years. I know how to do the next job, but they won't hire me. They're hiring some college graduate, and sometimes they were told, because he has a family to support, that's why he gets the job and not you. Not fair. So people would call us and they would send in their surveys, and they didn't have to take the risk of going public, because we would take this information and put it on a leaflet, and we were out there the next day passing it out in front of the bank and passing it out to depositors and big depositors, unions and community organizations, and saying, this is the bank that you bank at? Is this what you want? Tell them that you don't like it. And so all these different angles came in, and managers couldn't have been more surprised, because it was as if the wallpaper had come alive. They just weren't used to this. They just, it was brand new.
That was good. Yeah, how did you see the women change?
That was one of the most moving and fantastic things about our organizing, is that and it happened both to women who were directly involved in the organization and to many, many, many other women who just watched from the sidelines and changed. So women would come to our organization. I think at first we thought, well, with community organizing, you go out there, you find the leaders in the community, people who are involved in their church or neighborhood association or whatever. Well, in office work, there were no leaders. There was no organization. There was nobody you could just call up. So we had to develop leaders, not find them. And people would come, they would come to a meeting, maybe it was their first time at a meeting. Their hearts were pounding when it was time to go around and introduce themselves, just the way mine had been in the early consciousness raising group. I was afraid to make phone calls, and I had to write out a little script for myself to get up the courage to do it, to call people I didn't know. And actually, I think I think all of us, people who were shy, it actually helped us, because we were able to empathize with other women who were coming into the organization and realize, okay, this might not, it may seem simple to some, but maybe it's not. And so how do you take people through the first step and the second step? So first they come to a meeting, then they bring someone to a meeting, then they're in charge of bringing the cookies or setting up the chairs, or maybe introducing a speaker. And eventually, for example, I remember one time we went to a meeting with a government official in one of the anti-discrimination agencies. And there were maybe 20 of us standing on our lunch hour in front of this man's desk. And all of a sudden he came out from behind the desk and started pacing back and forth in a very menacing way. And he said, okay, I've heard your spokesperson speak. How about some of you less vocal ladies? I'd like to hear from some of you. And there was a loud crash because one of our party had just fainted dead away.
Oh.
And the meeting came to a chaotic end. I, as the organizer, rushed over to lift her feet off the floor and so on. So that was the end of that meeting. But that woman became the chair of 9 to 5.
Oh,
And she would always talk about how at one of her first meetings, she fainted. She was so terrified. But now look at her. And that happened over and over again. I would say the next phase was the union. So right from the start, we recognized that although we were getting a lot done outside the traditional labor movement, we thought our goal was that women office workers should have that option and should be able to join a union if they wanted to. And when we looked at history, we saw that American workers who did make lasting changes on the job did so through unions. So we went around Boston trying to meet union officials and seeing what we could do to bring our movement together with their movement.
Right.
And it was hard going. First of all, very few women union officials. And the men that we contacted, it was hard for them to see what we were talking about. They had never really, when people thought about who is a worker, they thought of a man in a hard hat with a wrench. They didn't see women sitting at a typewriter as real workers, and they didn't believe that such women would ever want to be part of a union. Meanwhile, a lot of them didn't, but our view was that it was really essential to bring those two groups together. So we kept at it, and we were undeterred by the sort of puzzlement of many of the union officials we ran into and met with. And eventually the Service Employees International Union granted us a charter for a local, and we had the right to hire our own staff, and we had our own constitution, and we could decide what union drives we would engage in. And it was a great experiment for us. So we immediately unionized a small publishing company and then a larger publishing company. And we got going with a radio station and got a lot of action going on university campuses. And we were really going. And we then later formed something called District 925. That union was called Local 925. A play on 9 to 5. And we wanted that confusion because we were working side by side, and we wanted people to think of the two in the same, in the same breath.
right.
So District 925 in 1980 was a nationwide effort. We had the right to hire people across the country, start union drives wherever we found them possible. And we were organizing in Syracuse and Seattle and Cincinnati and Cleveland and Boston. It was a little insane. And it was also, it happened to take place at the exact moment when, for example, Ronald Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers. And there was the employers really doubled down and hired anti-union consultants, union busters to put an end to this, because the era of employers and unions working together for a stable middle class and so on, that was starting to fray by 1980. And in the 80s, that tendency really accelerated, and it was very hard going. Our union lasted until the early 1990s, and we won excellent contracts. And it was very exciting because we had to come up with some really creative tactics. For example, at the University of Washington in Seattle, the tactic of emphasizing the issue of the Tampax machine became key. And in Cincinnati, we developed something called the herd, in which office workers stood up at a certain time. They blew whistles at 10 o'clock in the morning, and everybody walked off the job and started shaking these cans of beans as they paraded through the campus. It was a one-day strike. We had people standing outside the library in Cleveland ringing cowbells. We did all kinds of wacky things. And we also took the 9 to 5 style of really listening and really developing people into the union. And we not only did we win good contracts, but we brought women into the labor movement who then stayed for decades after the District 925 itself was dissolved and people merged into other SEIU locals. The organizers and the leaders stayed with SEIU and really brought the 9 to 5 spirit into the labor movement. And that, along with some really inspiring progress in hiring women into leadership positions in labor unions generally, that I think that's a legacy that I feel really proud of.
I'd like to go back on to a couple points, which is at what point you were working at Harvard and you were forming the organization and then ultimately the union. At what point did you become paid staff of whatever organization it was at the time?
Yeah, so before we had our first public meeting of 9 to 5 in the fall of 1973, the previous summer in 73, I had gone to the Midwest Academy. And then when I came back, I quit my job at Harvard and became a staffer for 9 to 5.
Yeah, okay. And then as you developed in Boston and you tried out a bunch of strategies there. And then how did you actually reach the women in the other cities? How did that work?
Yeah, so very early on, within a couple of years, we formed a coalition with other working women's groups in other cities and also started a few of them. So by the mid 70s, we had groups all the way from San Francisco through Cleveland, through New York and Washington, all working together. And over the years, we developed more and more of those organizations until we had several dozen chapters all over the country.
So they were identified as 925 or as 95.
9 to 5. Yes, it took a while for all the names to come together.
Right.
And,
Yes, sure.
but yes, eventually it
The
was
model
9 to 5.
basically was being imitated in other cities.
That's right.
As,
And we had people on our national staff that was based in Cleveland, but also we had satellite offices in Washington and Boston, helping people. We had actual people on staff that were just nurturing these young organizations and helping people go through the steps of, how do you gather statistics? How do you set your first targets? How do you bring people in? How do you develop leadership? And it was great. It was very exciting. And in late 70s, Jane Fonda came to us and she knew Karen Nussbaum, one of our founders, from the anti-war movement. And she said, how can I help you? And we said, make a movie. And she decided to make this movie, which was called 9 to 5 and came out in 1980. It was a huge box office hit, second only to The Empire Strikes Back in 1980. And we were positioned perfectly at that point because as the movie was coming out, not only could we feed stories to Jane Fonda's team, but when the movie came out, we had people ready to spread the word about it. And Karen went on a nationwide tour. Jane Fonda herself went on a tour to promote the movement behind the movie. And the two were really married to each other. And Dolly Parton's enduring anthem, Working 9 to 5, came out of that and really expressed what we were about. And the movie itself, I think Jane Fonda did an incredible job of really being true to what we were about. For example, we were, of course, very nervous that Hollywood wouldn't get it right.
right.
So,
Exactly.
for example, would they make everybody laugh at the secretaries instead of the bosses? No. There's almost no scene in the movie where there's more than one man in the scene. The men are not talking to each other, it's the women talk to each other. Was the movie going to act as if clerical work was somehow less than, that the only thing you would want to do was move out of it? No, we were very strong in everything we did, that office work was dignified work and deserved to be treated right.
Right.
And our slogan, Raises and Roses, which was a sort of a takeoff on the early 20th century bread and roses, expressed that rights and respect. There are many parts of the women's movement that that emphasized how to rise up. And we did that, but we also made clear that it wasn't just about rising up. It was about being treated fairly wherever you were. And we created this organization where women of all classes felt comfortable. And that didn't just happen. That was a conscious thing, and we had to work on that. And in like manner, I'm very proud of our multiracial character. In Boston, that was less possible. It was a
Right.
almost 90+% white workforce.
Right.
But that's part of the reason that we decided to form organizations in other cities. And in those places, our organization's leadership and our membership reflected the demographics of the clerical workforce itself. And again, that didn't just happen. That was something that took conscious effort and that we were very excited about. And I think something that really helped us was not to shy away from that issue. We always talked about race discrimination in the same breath as sex discrimination, and also to keep our target, keeps our focus on a common goal and a common enemy. And we really linked arms and moved forward together to win better policies on the job.
So that's excellent. Did you, I know there was some efforts at that time to not only get pay equality, but pay equity. Were you involved I know that Wynn Newman at AFSCME was one of the lawyers who did a lot of that work. Were you involved in any of that?
Yeah, our organization was part of a coalition pushing for that. Sometimes it was called comparable worth.
Right.
Pay equity also. AFSCME, the union, won some fantastic victories on that. And it's just I was just looking at some of that in writing this book that is coming out this year that I wrote, my memoir called Working 9 to 5. And I read about the AFSCME win in California, where you just look at these job descriptions and you see that, and we saw this everywhere when we were organizing in universities, like lawn care, lawn maintenance, building and grounds. The skill set for that was such and such. And then the skill set for an office worker was such and such, quite comparable. And the pay for buildings and grounds was like, much, much higher than for office work. So people won some very inspiring victories by pointing that out and pointing out that that was discrimination.
Mm-hmm. So yes, I think the contribution was enormous to getting people to understand more about comparable worth or whatever.
Right. And the 9 to 5 movie, I have to say, before the movie came out, I think it was sort of up to debate, open for debate, whether office workers should be treated like full workers and women should be treated equally with men. And well, maybe women just like doing that kind of work and that's all they like. And they don't want to be in management and they're not educated enough to be in management. And all those arguments kind of went by the wayside after the movie came out. I remember being on a bus one morning and I heard this woman talking to another woman saying, so he asked me to make the coffee and I said to him, I just watched 9 to 5 and I'm never going to make coffee for you again. So it was all over the culture. It was great.
Well, I mean, and for social change, as you know, I mean, affecting the culture in that way, that movie was tremendous. All the organizing had to be done too, but the movie, brought it to another level of consciousness for people. So
right, that's a good way of putting it.
After all this time, beautiful. So what? So you did that for what? How many years? And then what were the decisions that led you to take a different route?
Yeah, I was on the staff of 9 to 5 until 1985. So that was 12 years. I eventually was working in Washington, part of that pay equity coalition and doing other things in Washington. And by that time, I was about to have my second child. And I was somebody who found that the job of full-time activist and mom didn't fit together that well. So I remember taking my first child to a meeting in Cleveland of the national staff of 9 to 5, and one other time bringing a breast pump to Cleveland, and it was hard on me. And I know it wasn't hard on everybody, or maybe it was, but they put up with it. But I decided I needed something with a little more give. And I ended up in 1985 moving over to write speeches for the Service Employees International Union, write a column on work from the workers' point of view for the Philadelphia Daily News, and write freelance articles for women's magazines on issues that had to do with working women. A few years later, I became a speechwriter in the Clinton administration, moved to Washington, and continued writing speeches for SEIU after I finished doing that. And eventually moved on to sort of full-time writing. I wrote a play that was turned into a movie about my great aunt who was a retired secretary. And at first you might think, well, what does that have to do with? But I draw a straight line from my earlier work to finding this person whose voice had been completely unheard, who was considered an ordinary nothing burger, but who had a really profound inner life. And so that film called Beautiful Hills of Brooklyn is an expression of some of the same feelings I had as a young woman about women office workers. I then moved on to writing about how Lithuania is dealing with its Holocaust past. Again, I can draw a straight line there. And it involved like really listening to people, really opening my ears and stepping outside of my assumptions, and sort of encouraging my readers to do the same thing. And then in the last several years, I've been working on this memoir called Working 9 to 5 that took me back to these boxes of leaflets and photos and my diaries, and was really very moving experience to remember just what a gas we had and how we were just so hopped up with the sense of possibility and the belief that we could really make change, and basically the belief that we could do anything, you know. And I think that we didn't do everything we had planned to do and we had dreamed of, but I think that's really the way it is. I think that's always the way it is. And I'm really glad that we set our sights on some really huge social change that we wanted to make. You know, unionizing 20 million office workers, we didn't quite do that. But we did make change. We did, pregnancy discrimination was legal when we got started. It's not anymore. Sexual harassment was legal when we got started, and there wasn't even a name for it. That's changed. There are many more career ladders and ways for women in management than there were back then. And then there are also many challenges that we never even dreamed of. I think it's in many ways harder to be a working person in today's economy than it was in 1973, even though back then the wage gap between men and women was 57 cents. Women earned 57 cents to every dollar that men earned. Today it's like 81 cents, so that's a big improvement, but it's not perfect. It's lower for women of color. And the what they call the precarity of jobs, the lack of security, the gig jobs, the 24/7 being on call, the fact that now not only does it take 2 jobs to support a family, it takes 2 or 3 jobs to support one person. People don't have pensions, they don't have vacations, they don't have health care. Things have gotten a lot worse in some ways in today's economy. But at the same time, there's so many signs of hope. There's an upsurge of interest in unions and support for unions among today's workers. And I look around and I see people organizing in ways that really remind me of our spirit back then.
Yes.
People who are not necessarily going straight for the union election or straight for the union official, but
Right.
instead like getting together where they are and thinking of some crazy things to do. And things are bubbling up just the way they were in the early 70s.
Yes, I think, well, the Starbucks and Trader Joe's and those, I'm so excited about them. And it does feel more like back in the day when we
Mhm.
were organizing. And a lot of the jobs that you organized in 9 to 5 are gone, right?
Mhm.
Jobs changed, or, how they were done has changed. The technology impacted too. So,
Right. Yeah, we had no idea how much technology was going to change our jobs and change the world. I remember early on talking to some professor who said, yeah, the word processor, it's going to make you able to have your letter look a little tidier. But
yeah,
by the 80s, we were involved in talking about how like that sort of second by second computerized monitoring was making jobs so much more stressful.
right.
Um, and that you needed to really think about what chairs were like and what computer screens were like, and make sure that people were not injured on the job from the new technology.
Lithuanian, how did you get into the Lithuanian?
Yeah, good question. My mother's father was a Jew from Lithuania who had come over in the early 20th century, and who was really an inspiration for me in getting involved as an activist, because he came over and got involved in passing out leaflets and listening to the early women garment worker leaders speaking in these outdoor, standing on a soapbox and speaking to crowds and so on. And then my mother died rather young in 1989, and I decided that as a memorial to her, I was going to study Yiddish, the language of Jews in Eastern Europe. And I started taking classes and so on. And then I had an opportunity to actually go back and see the hometown of my family in Lithuania. And some people just go back and it's enough to just breathe the air and see those old houses and think about the Holocaust and terrible and the awful lives that people had, and also the beauty of those surroundings. But for me, it really expanded into something bigger, as I said, and I started looking at how the whole country of Lithuania itself was exploring this Jewish past and was sort of reckoning with the genocide that had taken place on their land. And what are they going to do with that? What do you do with a terrible past? And I expected, what I expected was not what I found. I thought that the leaders of this effort to come to terms with the past would be sort of trying to rub people's noses in how terribly people had behaved. And instead, they took sort of a roundabout route that encouraged people to come up with their own vehicles of remorse. And it just sort of helped people extend their hearts in such a way that then the next opening took place. And it was very, very moving to me to see people really opening up, and people would come to me. For example, an old man in my ancestral town made it known that he wanted to speak with a Jew before he died. And the head of the museum there asked me if I would be that Jew. And I wasn't sure at first that I wanted to be. I didn't know what he wanted out of me, and I didn't feel that I could be a representative that could forgive him or anything. But when we actually encountered each other, he didn't expect me to forgive him. He wanted to just simply bear witness. And it was very deep experience for me to see how he himself had been traumatized by the terrible trauma of what had happened in that town. And it gave me hope for the future.
That's a wonderful project. So that's ongoing. You keep up with the.
Yeah, and I became a Yiddish translator. I learned Yiddish well enough to translate work of women writing in Yiddish into English. And so there's now all kinds of this is part of a movement, of course, and I'm involved. I'm deeply involved in that.
Right. Are there a lot of Yiddish speakers left in the United States, or are they learning?
No, not particularly. I think for me, Yiddish is sort of a post-vernacular experience. It's really delving into the deep and bringing up these treasures that we can appreciate and learn from. There are people who bring up their children in Yiddish, mostly in the ultra-Orthodox community, but my project is to the side of that.
So back to the women's movement. So, so what have we not talked about that we need to talk about in terms of 9 to 5? You've given a very good description, and I think the influence that the movie had and continues to have, and all of your presence in doing the work you did. Any things that we haven't talked about that we should talk about?
I think I'd just like to talk a little bit about 9 to 5's relationship to the rest of second wave feminism.
Right.
First of all, many of the people who joined our organization made a point of telling us before they would come to their first meeting that they were not feminists.
Right.
And I did think of myself as a feminist in the sense that I felt that women were not being treated fairly, and that making sure that women were treated fairly was my main goal.
Right.
But a lot of women didn't really see it that way. But it was interesting. They would say, I'm not a feminist, but I believe in women's rights. I think women should be treated equally. I believe in equal pay for equal work. And so eventually some of those women started to think, you know what, maybe I am a feminist. But we didn't make that kind of a litmus test.
Right.
And so we made it possible for people who didn't sign on 100% to the whole thing to become involved with us. And I think we created this kind of safe space for people who didn't think of themselves as radicals, and they looked at other parts of the women's movement as it was presented in the media and thought, that's not me. There were a lot of very broad brush images of the women's movement as bra burners, man haters, and so on. Right. And I think that the women's movement was not that, really, most of it, and that wasn't a fair characterization, but there was some way in which we presented ourselves as definitely not that. And so we were a safe place for people to come to, and that too took work. That didn't necessarily come naturally, and we listened really carefully. For example, we noticed that people didn't talk about themselves as workers. A shock to us. They called themselves employees. They didn't talk about wages. They talked about pay. Sometimes they didn't use the word bosses. They talked about management. All these things are really important. Yeah. And we also, unlike other parts of the women's movement, we didn't eat each other alive. We had a great time. We got along great, and we couldn't get enough of each other. And our staff was just like so exciting, and we were all in there in this joint venture and so on. And it just somehow we sort of scooted past this tendency in other parts of the women's movement to get so deep into, say, theory or rigid practice or so on, that it just was not part of us. And I don't want to tar the women's movement in general as being all that. It wasn't, but there was something about us that was just a little bit unique, I think, and really geared toward the people we were trying to attract.
So what should be done today to replicate that kind of approach? Because we have so much division in the country, including the women. So
yeah, we had a 9 to 5 reunion a couple of years ago, and we asked people to fill out a questionnaire. Of course, can't be a 9 to 5 meeting without a survey. So we had a survey, and we asked people, what's your advice for today's activists? And people said all kinds of things. A lot of what I've been telling you, really listen, be there for somebody who's maybe not like you. They're waiting for you to reach out, do it. Keep your focus on the boss, on your goal, have specific things that you're really trying to get to. don't get ahead of yourself. Don't form an organization without knowing what you want to do, and so on. But I think the thing that struck me the most was somebody said, I don't think that today's activists need our advice. I think there's some amazing activists out there. They know what they're doing. They're following their own noses, just as we did. Back then, there were people who had been through years and years of organizing who said, yeah, we've tried all this before. You're 23 years old. You don't know what you're doing. You're never going to succeed. And then there were other people who just welcomed us with open arms and acted as if they'd just been waiting for us, and they were very forgiving. And they basically said, you're going to find your own path. And we listened to our elders, and we were very eager to learn from people who had experience doing what we were trying to do. But we also just went for it, and we figured it out. And I think that's what's going to happen in the years to come with today's activists as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's wise. And I think you're right. I think it's right. And the reason we want to preserve this history of our time, so that people have that as a resource if they choose to access it. Because I think some of the things that happened could be replicated. Some of the strategies could be, if not replicated, at least given some inspiration from them.
Yeah, I was very hungry for the experiences of people who come before me. And we had this one woman who was in her 80s, who was a longtime suffragist, who would come and speak at our outdoor rallies on National Secretary's Day. And she would say, when I was 5 years old, my mother took me to see Susan B. Anthony. And my heart just swelled, So I've always just been hungry to be connected to the women who came before me. And it's been very gratifying to me that some of today's activists tell me, we stand on the shoulders of you women who came before us.
I think that's why it's important, all your books, but the book you just wrote about your experience in the women's movement, in the working women's movement, is a valuable resource. And thank you for that. So.